Years ago, I examined the concepts of the inside and outside in order to better understand how the members of a particular California Indian tribe might have ordered the world around themselves. The ethnographic record suggested that an elastic boundary existed between what was perceived to be that of culture, what can be considered to be the inside, versus that of nature, or the outside. Power existed on either side of the boundary, but it was potentially malevolent and certainly less controllable outside of culture. Recently, I've been looking for similar boundaries in other, more contemporary communities. For example, at Olompali State Historic Park, the self-named chosen family participated in a 2-year experiment in communal living. This was in 1967, 1968, and 1969, when the park was privately owned and known to the Commune members as Rancho Olompali, or simply the ranch. During its first year of existence, the Commune was closed to outsiders, with membership tightly regulated. Members of the Commune chose who would be part of their family. Outside influences were thus more easily mitigated, and a simple, albeit ample, structure abounded within this intentional community. However, during the second year, the Commune underwent some fundamental changes, and as a result, it was opened to outsiders. In other words, anyone could come and live there. This change resulted in a sudden and drastic increase in membership, and with that came the appearance of various kinds of negative influences and ill effects. Opening the Commune imploded the previous structure and eventually led to the societal disintegration and ultimate collapse of the community. Not all of the newcomers were there for the right reasons, and conflict arose between some of the old-timers and some of the newcomers. The Commune was originally founded in part as a way to raise and protect the founding members' children, primarily young girls. Many of those same girls were frightened by some of the strangers who arrived after the community was opened, and for good reason. Elements of the chosen family's archaeological record reflect aspects of societal collapse at Olompali. Such a collapse is supported by the oral histories of some of the Commune's members as well. Another example of a modern community comes from the Marine Corps. From 1961 to 1969, L Company, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines, which was then a unit of the United States Marine Corps Reserve, held periodic field training exercises at Annandale State Park in Santa Rosa. At the time, Annandale was a private property known as Annandale Farms. The property's owner, the industrialist Joe Coney, allowed various civic and church groups to use his ranch for their outings, including camping and fishing trips, group hikes, and equestrian rides. This included the local Marine Corps unit, L Company, which was based in Santa Rosa. The Marines requested to use the ranch for their field training exercises. Coney required that those seeking permission to use his ranch write a letter of request stating their intentions. Annandale State Park's archives contain 16 such letters written by the Marine Corps requesting Coney's permission to train at Annandale Farms. Although the letters are brief, they include information specific to the intended purpose of the exercises. Interestingly, it's within these letters that you see how the Marine Corps Reserve was preparing for what they felt would be their eventual activation and deployment to Vietnam. This wasn't to happen, though. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson instituted a draft lottery to provide the necessary personnel for the growing war in Vietnam. President Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had spent days debating the best way to grow the war. One option was to activate the military reserves, as had been done for the Korean War. There were over 300,000 reservists available to be called up, including the men of L Company. Or Johnson and McNamara could increase the civilian draft. President Johnson feared that calling up the reservists would send the wrong message to our enemies and cause the former Soviet Union and Communist China to come to the aid of the North Vietnamese. Johnson chose to grow the draft in order to grow the war. However, by turning to the draft, rather than calling up the nation's reserve forces, Johnson may have sent an unintended message to Americans of draft age. After 1965, a considerable number of draft-age men joined the reserve forces as an honorable alternative to risking the draft and possible deployment to Vietnam. In essence, Johnson's decision opened L Company and other reserve units like it to the outside, resulting in an infusion of new reservists. Some of these new recruits didn't necessarily want to be Marines and didn't completely embrace the traditions of the Marine Corps' culture, a culture that can be deemed the inside. This was in stark contrast to the men who had joined L Company prior to 1965, many of whom had already served stints of active duty and were prepared to do so again if called upon. At about the same time, the draft infused the military with an army of draftees who also didn't want to be there. This was especially the case after the Tet Offensive in 1968. As the morale of the active forces declined following Tet, a similar situation may have characterized L Company. I was interested to learn if the archaeological record at Annandale and the oral histories of former L Company members might indicate a subtle decline in troop discipline from 1966 to 1969, following the opening of the company. To find out, I conducted archaeological investigations, hoping to identify any decline in morale. I examined the artifacts I recovered to determine what they might be saying to me. While I found a few things I considered interesting, to date the results of my archaeological investigations are inconclusive. The interviews I conducted with former members of L Company were also problematic. I spoke with a number of former riflemen and several of the commanding officers. Based on my interviews, I have no doubt that some men joined the reserve force after 1965 in order to avoid deployment to Vietnam. One or two of them told me as much. But once in uniform, they did what was expected of them. They were good Marines. When I asked about a noticeable decline in discipline and morale, the newer recruits hinted at it, but they said it affected others in the unit, not them. I suspect the opening L Company to outsiders had an adverse effect on the unit, similar to what was experienced by the chosen family, when their commune was open to people from the outside. But, unlike the commune, the company didn't implode and disappear. Based on my interviews with the company's commanding officers, I know that they were prepared to deal with whatever changes came after 1965, and they obviously dealt with it. That was in stark contrast to what company commanders were dealing with in Vietnam in the late 1960s, in terms of cases of fragging, servicemen being AWOL, and incidents of desertion. Of course, personnel deployed to Vietnam were in a much different situation than the reservists of L Company. The reservists spent most of their nights at home and didn't have anyone trying to kill them. That was undoubtedly a mitigating factor in how sharp a decline in troop morale was registered at home versus in Vietnam. Whether a hippie or Marine, people of the 1960s navigated social constructs that relegated them to one side or the other of culturally imposed boundaries. Human communities could be open or closed, and personal experiences often depended on whether one was an insider or an outsider. Hippies are thought of as having been part of the countercultural movement. Being counter to culture is the same as being outside of the dominant culture. In one of my interviews, a former rifleman in L Company told me that there were a lot of hippies, his word, in the company when he served. He joined the reserve in late 1965 after receiving his own draft notice. Those Marines he described as being hippies were there in an attempt to avoid going to Vietnam. They were Marines, and yet they weren't. They were outsiders. Contrast that to some of the reservists who had joined L Company prior to 1965. When the war in Vietnam escalated after 1965, some of them went active duty and deployed to Vietnam. Within Marine culture, they were the insiders. The boundary that appears to have delineated the men of L Company as being either insiders or outsiders correlated closely with President Johnson's decision to grow the war by increasing the civilian draft. Similarly, the boundary that delineated insiders and outsiders at Olompali was determined by who was invited to join the commune as opposed to those who took it upon themselves once the commune had been opened. If we contrast culture with nature, then those we deem to be counterculture are outside of culture and thus of the wild. Consider what is meant by a wild horse versus a tame horse, or new shoes versus broken-in shoes. Wild rivers are dammed. Wild horses are broken. Even in boot camp, a recruit is taken in and broken down and then rebuilt as a Marine. To be viewed as being outside the dominant culture is to be seen as a potential threat. Insiders, though, are not perceived as threats, even if at times they are. The heavy work of culture depends on insiders, but the definition of culture expands and contracts based on the interaction of outsiders with the perceived boundaries separating inside and out. In our present-day world, the perceived boundary dividing the inside and outside is as prevalent as it ever was in the past. I think this divide drives most of our current political conflicts. Indeed, a society that's conflicted over who is an insider and who's an outsider is destined for conflict. Perhaps we fail to recognize that at our own peril.